Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am so excited to welcome you to today's conversation on the Oregon Trail. If you are like me, you might know the Oregon Trail from elementary school, from perhaps playing the video game. I have my own version right here. But in Katie Hickman's article, her eye-opening, fascinating kind of road trip, historical journey along the Oregon Trail, I learned how much I didn't know. It's just an extraordinary experience, and also how much we all don't know about the people impacted on the Oregon Trail, by the Oregon Trail, both 200 years ago and today. So I'm so excited to discuss that today with Katie, and kind of dig deeper into her article, The Elusive History of the Oregon Trail. So if you don't know Katie Hickman, by the way, she's a best-selling author of 10 books. I really encourage you all to, we will send you links to her work, but go find her titles, read her books. Her most recent work, Brave Hearted, was preceded by She Merchants, Buccaneers, and Gentlewomen, British Women in India, 1600 to 1900, and by the highly acclaimed series of novels, The Aviary Gate, The Pindar Diamond, and The House at Bishopsgate. Her books, of which, again, there are 10, have been translated into 20 languages. So happy that Katie is joining us today from the Thames River in London. She is on a boat in the Thames. We're crossing our fingers that the internet is stable and the waves aren't too rocky, but bear with us if anything goes awry. Before we will even let that happen, some brief housekeeping. Alta Live, which is where you are now, is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. This is our current issue, issue 29. We've made 29 of these. And this is all about a reckoning of the West, hence Katie's article about the Oregon Trail. We are an award-winning quarterly magazine and website focused on California and the West. We have events like this, free events like this every week, Alta Live. The monthly California Book Club, this October 17th. We are so excited to welcome Tobias Wolff, author of This Boy's Life. That's a free Zoom discussion. And we have a great website. If you like the work we do and want to support it, I so hope you will consider becoming a member and subscribing. It's $50 a year. You get 4 copies of the magazine, a little present in the mail from us, and full access to our website and archives. We're also having an event. Hi, Cambria, California. We're having an event on Friday, October 18th. Through Litquake at the Verity Club. Come to this. It's going to be great. It's the California Book Club Live with John Freeman, Andrew Sean Greer, Maxine Hong Kingston, and Jaime Cortez. We're going to have all sorts of fun surprises at that. So anyway, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions about the Oregon Trail. Ask Katie questions. She knows a ton about this. This interview will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later this afternoon. And it is so great to see where folks are zooming in from today. I see Cambria, San Marcos, Texas. Let us know in the chat. Katie, again, thank you so much for joining us at 8:30 in the evening, your time.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure. That's why it's all dark behind me. I probably look like I'm getting ready for Halloween or something, but
well, welcome. It's so great to have you. It's great to have all of our people zooming in from all over the place. I want to kind of dive in. And folks, I've made a mini slideshow, as we like to do here at Alta Live, to kind of let us know, give us the lay of the land. So I really actually we're going to start with a map, if that's okay with you, Katie. And
yeah, great.
Here, I screwed it up a little bit, but we're going to start. All right. So can you kind of give us a very brief, super Reader's Digest version of what is the Oregon Trail? When did it start? Who used it? When did it end?
Okay.
It was
so the Oregon Trail, which is really, really neatly done on your very nice map, was the main artery down which all the emigrants who were going west during the mid-19th century, kind of opening up the United States of America from being this relatively small 26 states focused on the east to becoming the United States that we know today. And people would gather at Independence, Missouri, which is the first place on the far right-hand side of the map. And they would make their way with their wagons and their livestock, and usually doing it most on foot, and they would make their way all the way along this green line all the way to Oregon City, and that was the classical Oregon Trail. And they did it to get free or very nearly free land, to make new lives for themselves, and just out of a kind of general sense of adventure. And that the main thing that really surprised me when I was doing the research for the book that I wrote, which is called Bravehearted, on which this article is based, was that how slowly it started. So it started in about 1840 with literally one family going west. And then it went up to the next year, it was 100 people. The year after that, in 1842, it was 200 people. The year after that, in 1843, it was 300 people. Then when gold was discovered in California, there was another route, by the way, that went down further south all the way to San Francisco. Something like 10,000 people all gathered in Independence to go west. And so the numbers grew greater and greater and greater as the years went by, exponentially greater. But the classic Oregon Trail were the folks who went west basically in the 1840s and the 1850s. When before the route was very well trodden, when it was still incredibly dangerous for all sorts of reasons. We can come on to that. All sorts of reasons, probably not the ones that people usually think. And a lot of these folks died, and it was a really, really tough journey. And having done that journey now myself in a nice air-conditioned car with a sat nav and a trunk full of my own groceries, and it was quite a tough trip to do today. So the guys, the folks who did it back in the mid-19th century, I have nothing but admiration for them, and for the sheer kind of perseverance that they had. These were families as well. It wasn't just big tough guys. These were women. They were taking their families, taking tiny children with them. Women who were giving birth along the route. Nothing stopped for the trail. You just once you started out, you had to keep going, or you wouldn't get to the other end.
Right. You had to, I mean, again, I know this from the game. You've got to make it before winter hits.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I had no idea that so many people made this journey on foot.
Yes.
My vision of this is very, as we were discussing before we started, it's Little House on the Prairie. It's neat and clean, and there's floral dresses and bonnets involved. And you
Yes.
paint a
Yes.
much grittier picture, which obviously makes sense. But how
Yeah.
do people do this on foot? It's 2,200 miles. It seems
Yeah.
impossible.
It's still, even now, I still find it almost inexplicable how they were able to do it. And don't forget, a lot of people did die along the way. But you had it was quite expensive to go on the Oregon Trail. So it took a lot of preparation. So you couldn't just tip up an Independence and say, oh, I'm off to Oregon, next week. A lot of these people spent years preparing, and they would get their livestock together, they would get their wagon together. Women often made the classical kind of cover that you see on those big wagons. They didn't just make the wagon cover; they would sew it with their own hands, and in some cases they would even weave the actual cloth from their own flax. I mean, it was, there were not as many shops then as we have now. So it was all very, very homemade. And so in your wagon, you had to take your provisions, you had to take your food that you were going to need for the 6 months plus that it was going to take you to make this great journey. And in the very early days, people were rather unsure as to how long it was going to take them. And typically, they either took too few provisions with them because they thought it was only going to take a couple of months, and so they died of starvation along the way, or they took too many provisions, and then their oxen just, imagine, it's not just the people, the humans who have to walk that way, it's the livestock that you have to get all that distance as well. And so there was always oxen who pulled the wagons, not horses, because horses weren't strong enough. But even these great big oxen, the typical ones that you see in the pictures, if there wasn't enough fodder for them, they would fail and just collapse and die. And so there are these extraordinary accounts of the whole way, this whole way along the Oregon Trail, along this green line, would just be littered with caches of things that people could no longer take with them. And at the
Wow.
beginning, it was things like, you wanted to take your grandma's heirlooms with you. So you took, the complete works of Shakespeare or some beautiful piece of furniture. No, that had to go. Those were the first things that went. And by the end, it was even, any excess food that people had would have to be chucked over the side. So it wasn't a pristine trail like you see, the typical thing that you see in the movies, these lovely emigrants, as you say, in their sunbonnets and their floral dresses,
Yeah.
going romantically into the sunset. This was a really dirty, people had all their human needs that they had to take care of along the way. So it became extremely smelly after a while. A lot of the water would become contaminated if people weren't careful about it. If livestock died, they'd just be left by the side of the road. And if people died, typically in 1849, which was the big gold rush year, the year the gold was discovered in 48. And so the following year in 49, it was the 30,000 people all leaving all at once. And there was a cholera epidemic. And so people in their diaries describe how the whole way along the trip to I should say that the trail to California went as far as Fort Hall. So if you look in the very middle of the map there, the two trails, the California Trail and the Oregon Trail, had the first beginning part to Fort Hall, and then the California Trail dipped down. But the whole of that trail was covered in crosses because people were just buried by the side of the road. You couldn't stop. You had to literally bury your loved person, whoever it was, your child, your granny, your mother, your father. You stopped for a few hours, you dug a shallow grave, and then you moved on because you didn't have enough food to be able to just, hang around on the trail. You had to keep going. So it
Um, I
was it was really tough.
I want to kind of move through some photos. This is South Path City, Wyoming. This still is standing, or this reproduction
Yeah,
still exists. I was particularly struck by this photo, as was John, our creative director. He's like, include the wagon ruts are still there,
yeah, yeah.
which is just extraordinary. But I do get a sense of, you can see how rough it is. And it's just endless. It is absolutely endless.
Endless, endless. I think this photo must have been taken near
Oh,
South Pass. So South Pass is the huge corridor. Oh, this is Independence Rock, big monument on the way. But South Pass was it called itself a pass. Actually, you could barely notice you're going through it because it's this very wide corridor. I think it's about 20 or 30 miles across between two mountain ranges. But this scrub that you can see, this sagebrush, that was what people were having to walk through because the wagons were full of your supplies. So you had to be almost dead or have had some terrible injury to be able to ride in the wagon. Typically, the
oh,
wagons were not for riding in, they were for carrying your goods. And so everybody had to walk. And it looks really soft and sort of, it looks like quite flat and deserty. I actually got out of my car at one point to walk a bit of the way to see what it would have been like. And this soil is baked so hard. It was like walking on cinders, and I wouldn't know how long a pair of your average modern trainers, if you were wearing that and just walking along, I don't think your modern trainers would last very long. And these emigrants, they would literally wear out the leather on their shoes and would have to walk barefoot some of the time. And it ripped. Women, don't forget, were wearing long dresses, not very practical, and their skirts would get ripped, literally ripped to shreds on this really tough, it's a semi-arid plant, so they're tough and sharp, and they are going to slice through your dress and your petticoat and your probably homemade shoes that you're wearing. So, you know, it was a very I think it was a psychologically tough journey as well as a physically tough journey.
Yeah.
That was my big thing that I realized from having done this trip myself. I wrote my book before I'd been on the trail. It was kind of after, you know, I just kind of felt I had to go and see it for myself. And I only really realized when I'd, you know, driven through this extraordinary landscape, day after day after day of this sagebrush, what that must have felt like if you were a family. You know, if you were a woman with a family of young children, maybe a small baby, you know, you might have just given birth along the trail. You were so vulnerable. And somehow you had to keep your whole family together and not faint with horror when yet another valley opened out in front of you and you
Yeah.
knew that you still had a really, really long way to go.
It's gonna make me cry. Um, Speaking of women, let's get to, I want to kind of wrap up my slideshow so we can really talk here. Tell us about Narcissa Whitman, please.
Okay, I love this picture. This picture is a great picture. So Narcissa Whitman was a Presbyterian missionary lady who was one of the first two white women to make this journey west. And she went with a fellow missionary whose name was Eliza Spalding, and they were both married to fellow missionaries. They both actually married in order to be able to fulfill their ambition to become missionaries, which is a very interesting thing about them, because women in those days, you know, you got married and you had a family and your life was a kind of in the domestic sphere. Women didn't have ambitions to go out into the world and do something, but Narcissa Whitman did. And her journey was in 1836, so it was 4 years before the Oregon Trail kind of proper started. And it was the success of her journey with Eliza Spalding that made people realize that a woman was a white woman, I should say. Obviously, she wasn't the first, you know, there were Indigenous women who'd done this journey. She was the first, they were the first two white women to make this journey. And they, despite the fact of its incredible toughness, and they had many adventures along the way, they both survived. They went from independence all the way to, on the map it shows the Fort Walla Walla, anyway, all the way to what is now Oregon City. And they lived to tell the tale. And so when the news of the success of their journey kind of percolated back east again, because there was a certain amount of to and fro with fur trappers and traders were using that route in advance of the emigrants. They've been doing it for 30 or 40 years before. There was also a sea route that it was possible to do. So, you know, news did get from Oregon, which, by the way, was not American, not part of the US then. Oregon country, as it was then known, was disputed territory between Great Britain and the United States of America, and they hadn't settled their dispute yet, so it didn't belong, and I'm making inverted comma motions with my hands, because of course the land truthfully belonged to the Native American tribes who lived there, but in sort of, you know, Western realpolitik, Britain and the US thought that they were able to just parcel it out between them. So it didn't belong to anybody, and it certainly wasn't American national territory. And these missionaries had to get passports in order to make the journey. I love that fact. It's such an extraordinary fact. Who would have thought? I certainly didn't realize that. But it was their success in surviving this journey that people had thought it was an impossible journey for a white woman to be able to withstand the depredations on that journey. But these two women managed it, and it was their example that really started the westward migrations. Four more women, missionary women, left 2 years after that in 1838. And then the first non-missionary woman went with her family in 1840. So they were the sort of prime movers of the Oregon Trail, with varying varying results, let's just say.
Yeah. Can you tell
Do you want
us?
me to say more?
Well,
More
can you
about
tell us
Narcissa?
what happened to
Yeah,
Narcissa?
well, she was a missionary, so she went because she wanted to convert the Cayuse tribe in what is now Oregon, and she was a woman of profound religious conviction. She was absolutely serious in her. She thought that if she didn't show these people savages, as she called them, it reads very it's a difficult read to read her diaries and so forth today. But if she didn't bring the truth of Christianity as she saw it to the savages, again, inverted commas, they were going to go to hell for all eternity. So to go and convert them. So there were four missionaries, Eliza, Narcissa, and their two husbands. Eliza, they all fell out. That's one of the things that none of them got on with one another. So they ended up founding two separate missions. And Narcissa Whitman and her husband, Marcus Whitman, were at Fort, what I think you pronounce it Walla Walla. I used to
Walla
say
Walla,
Walla
yeah.
Walla, but I think it's Fort Walla Walla.
Yeah.
And amongst the amongst the Cayuse, and they ended up being murdered, butchered by the Cayuse tribe. And this provoked an incredible act of retribution against all Native Indigenous people in the West. It was a profoundly terrible thing. It was a terrible thing, obviously, for Narcissa and her husband. But the reason that they were massacred, and this is something that you don't hear enough about, in my opinion, the reason that they were massacred is that almost half of the Cayuse tribe, including almost all of their children, had died from measles the year before because successive waves of emigrants were coming in. They were going past the Whitman mission, which was quite well established by then. We're talking about, I think it was 1856. So it was just over 10 years after the missionaries had first kind of landed in Oregon. And the Whitmans were seen to be aiding and helping the white emigrant. Marcus Whitman was a doctor as well as a missionary. He was a medic, and he was able to help a lot of the white people who were suffering from measles. It was an epidemic carried in on the emigrant trains, wagon trains of that year, 1856. He was able to help some of the white people who were slowly recovering, but the indigenous people, because they had no, they had no they were terribly vulnerable to these new diseases. They died in enormous numbers, and it was devastating for their tribe. And they lost, I think, I'm right in saying they lost, if not all their children, then the majority of their children. It was an absolute catastrophe for the Cayuse. And so they begged Narcissa and her husband to leave. They said, you're no good to us. You haven't given us your power. They thought that they were going to share their spiritual power with them. You're just helping these other white people coming in, and you're taking our land, and you're taking our grasslands, and you're trying to fence off our traditional, the place where we hunt. And please leave. We don't want you here anymore. And of course, the missionaries refused. And it was at that point that a small renegade group of these Cayuse warriors went in, and they killed Narcissa and her husband, three or four of their adopted children, and some of the other settlers. So it was a tragedy for the white people, but the repercussions for the Cayuse were absolutely enormous, and it kind of set a pattern for some of the terrible things that went on later on in the emigration. So, I started out I feel very ambivalent about Narcissa. In one way, I admire her enormously. She was an incredibly brave woman. It was like going to the moon, what she did. There was no precedent for it. She didn't know what she was going to find. She left everything that she loved behind. There were no other white women there, apart from Eliza, who she didn't really get on with. They're very, very brave, very well-meaning, but actually it was a disaster. So it's one of the many ambivalences of the history of the West.
This is such a humongous topic, and we all need to read your book. And hopefully you continue to write about this for Alta. But I do want to kind of explore a little bit before I dive into audience questions. There you mentioned that there are so many voices about the Oregon Trail's impact that haven't been documented. Is there an include, namely the experience of Indigenous people as this was happening, and Indigenous women who you mentioned are used as a kind of a conduit, an interpreter, a connection between immigrants, pioneers, and Indigenous tribes? Is there any kind of documentation of what it was like? Have any of these voices or experiences been recorded anywhere on behalf of Indigenous people?
There are a few. There are a few. They are. I looked really, really hard to find as many Indigenous sources as I could, and uh, I did find a handful. Obviously, there are many, many more from the white perspective. You know, women were literate. They wrote. They had the time, especially they even wrote on the, while they were in their camps at night when they were going along on the trails. There are amazing, amazing first-hand accounts of the real kind of nuts and bolts of what it was like, that experience. And there are just a handful of Indigenous women who much later in their life wrote down, there's one woman in particular who's a sort of heroine of mine. There's a woman called Josephine Waga, and many of these Indigenous women have names that are sort of, well, for me, were sort of misleading because it doesn't sound like an Indigenous name. She was actually a mixed race woman. Her mother was a Brule Lakota, red cormorant woman who married a French American fur trapper. And so Josephine was brought up as a biracial woman on the plains, on the Great Plains. And much, much later in her life, after kind of when it was all over, so to speak, and you know, all Native Americans had been pushed onto reservations. It all happened incredibly fast. From 1840, by the 1880s, there was no frontier left, and all Native Americans.
Oh, we lost Katie. She's on the Thames. She's she's going to come back to us. She's on her journey.
Living
Here she
on
is.
reservations. So in historical terms, have I gone? Oh, sorry.
Back.
I feel as if I'm a bit in my own prairie schooner, actually, kind of sailing along. I'm not sailing on a prairie, I'm sailing along on the river. I think it's high tide, that's why it's doing this. I'm back. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. So where did you hear me talk about Josephine Wagner? You heard
Yes.
me talk
Yes.
about she
So
was
later in life, Josephine finally was kind of able to put down her thoughts.
later in life, she realized that the elders of her mother's tribe, all these Lakota, her mother was the same tribe as Sitting Bull. So she realized the elders of her mother's tribe were all dying out. And the way that they tell their history and their stories is largely through, it's an oral history,
Oral history.
not so much written down. Their tradition was not so much to write things down. I think sometimes they did, but mostly they didn't. It was historians within the tribe who would learn these histories. So Josephine spent something like 20 years of her much later life going around all the old people and getting their experiences and writing them down so that they would be preserved. And at the same time, she wrote down like a little memoir of her own life, what it was like for her as a child growing up. And she also helped another woman whose name is Susan Bordeaux, who left a very, very wonderful account of growing up in Fort Laramie. Now, those of your people who tuned in who know about the Oregon game that you were talking about, Beth, that I don't know anything about, but I'm going to go out and get one. This sounds absolutely great. So Fort Laramie, I believe, is a big place of interest on the Oregon Trail game, and it was the great, it was one of the only places in the early days of the Oregon Trail where there was a settlement of any kind at all. And this other woman, Susan Bordeaux, grew up there, and so she wrote this absolutely fascinating memoir, all done through, sort of recorded, wrote down her memories, because I don't think she was able to write herself. And so those are two. Yeah, only two, but they are very, very different from the point of view of the Native American people, and that's terribly rare. It's sort of, it from the historian's point of view, it's really difficult, because I'm very conscious that my book and the article in Alta is necessarily weighted very heavily in favor of a white point of view, because that's where the sources are. So I've tried to put in the Native American view as much as I'm able to. And I'm sure there must be other sources out there that I don't know about, or perhaps there have been things that are preserved orally in different tribes that I also don't know about. I'm sure there must be more out there, but we need more. We really do. We need many, many more. We need more accounts than are published already. Although the ones that are there are just fabulous, because they're tragic, they're heartbreaking, but they are written in this very beautifully sort of poetic, I can only describe it as a beautifully poetic way that both Josephine and Susan had of describing the prairies, what they meant to them, what it was like to go hunting, what it was like to live in these teepee villages that moved around in the Powder River country, for example. And they are beautiful, beautiful accounts of what that now, I wouldn't like to say whether that had vanished or not, but it can surely not exist to a very great extent anymore, that's for sure.
Before we lose you to the London night, I want to grab a couple of audience questions. Harold asks, what became of all the valuables discarded along the Oregon Trail?
Oh, good question. I mean, a very good question. I mean, well, Susan Bordeaux describes how so there was a community of about 300 families, mixed race families of various Native American women who'd married French American fur trappers and traders. And they had a larger community in and around the Fort Laramie area. And Susan Bordeaux, describes how well equipped their houses were, because they were, these were just stuff lying by the side of the road. They hadn't stolen it. It was just, beautiful bookshelves, beautiful bits of furniture. So their houses were very well furnished by all
Do you
these.
think it's
This
from the discarded?
yeah, yeah. No. She actually says there were lots of, beautiful bookcases and French, dining room tables and French, chairs and things like that people had taken with them. I mean, on the whole, people didn't try to take furniture, but they would take heirlooms. So books was a classic thing. And I guess if you dug around there now, maybe you'd still find some of those
Few
books
pages.
there. People did used to cache things. So they would dig holes in the ground. Sometimes they'd just chuck it out and it would be lying by the side of the road, but they would also dig holes in the ground and bury their goods there, thinking that they would go back and get them later. So possibly some of them were retrieved later on. Some of them would just have rotted away. A lot of it was food supplies that they were just too heavy to take. Those would have rotted. The Native American tribes would have picked up quite a lot of things. So, different things happened, I guess.
You mentioned that there were fatal dangers along the Oregon Trail that might surprise us. Can you share some of those?
Well, the most surprising thing is that the people who were, the emigrants along the trail, the thing that they were most afraid of, without exception, was attack by Native American tribes. And it was very, very, very rare to be attacked by a Native American on the route. But I should say, in the first 20 years. Later on, the Indian Wars happened, and then it was kind of much more of a free-for-all. But for the first 20 years, the Native American tribes, the Lakota and the Cheyenne and these people, it was a trading opportunity for them. They didn't see any threat in these people because the numbers were still relatively small. So they couldn't imagine that these small numbers of people in there rather fragile little wagon trains would ever be a threat to them. So they would trade with them. You know, they may have demanded presents from them, but they didn't attack or kill them. But that was what everyone was afraid of. There is a figure, and I now can't quite, it was something like less than 5% of all deaths, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact figure, but it's a really low figure. Less than 5%, let's just say, of all deaths along the Oregon Trail in those first years were from Native American attacks. You were much more likely to die of a disease. So, and all those infectious diseases, cholera was a big killer. Smallpox, the measles epidemic killed people off. You know, what they called camp fever, so dysentery. You know, a lot of people died of dysentery, which would have been a miserable way to die, but a lot of people did. People died of gunshot wounds that they inflicted on themselves. So accidents with guns were very
Oh,
common.
accidental.
Yeah, accidental. You know, I'm sure probably there was the odd actual fight and people were probably, I don't know, got into a bit of an argument, but usually that didn't happen. People traveled in companies together and there were rules that, you know, what people would and wouldn't do. So it was usually they were accidental deaths. People, you know, would be cleaning a gun and it would go off and people, you know, as happens today. Women were very vulnerable because if they were married, if you think this journey at the beginning was a minimum of 6 months to do that journey. And if you got lost, which often they did, it could take longer. So if you're a married woman, the chances are that you were either pregnant or were going to have a baby at some point along the way. So you and I can't, oh my goodness me, all married women with children, close your ears now. I came across this absolutely terrible account. This poor woman who went into labor in the middle of a thunderstorm in the middle of the prairies. And there was a flash flood in the middle of this happened a lot in the summer. You get these huge rains and then a flash flood would come. And so her women friends no, there were no doctors, nothing like that. So her women friends were literally had her on two chairs and they were with their skirts pulled up, and this poor woman with all this flood water going, you know, going past her. Her women friends were trying to help her deliver this baby, you know, on a couple of chairs with in the middle of a flood. And so you can imagine, you know, postpartum deaths was very common. You know, the mother and baby, you know, women were before and after birth were very, very vulnerable indeed in these, especially in these really quite insanitary conditions. After the first few years, very insanitary conditions.
It's extraordinary to hear you talk. I mean, you're so passionate about history and particularly women's role in history. It's also making me very grateful for my air-conditioned house and my giving birth in
And
a hospital.
modern obstetrics
Yes.
and pain relief.
Yeah, even
Yes.
Tylenol. I mean, I'll take it. Um,
Yeah.
Katie, this is extraordinary. For those that haven't had a chance to read Katie's amazing article, you can do so at altaonline.com. We're going to send you links to where you can buy her books, where you can read this article, where you can learn more about Alta. We're going to invite you to all of our upcoming parties. Thank you all so much for coming today. And Katie, I'm so grateful to you for this. Not only is it late where you are, but just your passion and enthusiasm and willingness to talk about this so naturally and authentically is just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. It was an extraordinary experience for me, and I'll never, one of the great experiences of my life. So it's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you, Beth, very much indeed. It's been really great. And thank you, Alta. And I hope I'm going to write for you again one of these fine days. That's what my plan is, what I'm hoping to
Good,
do anyway.
good. Well, we'll have you back on Alta Live for your next story.
Yes,
Folks,
please. That would be
join us. Join us next week. We're going to talk to Susan Shilton about mapping the West. This is, speaking of maps, this is an insert that comes in the current issue, and we're going to go through all of these
Oh,
extraordinary
it's
maps.
so great. It's really great. I love that insert. I'm going to keep it. Brilliant, brilliant.
Good. Well, that's the
Yeah.
idea. Well,
Yeah.
join us. Thank you
Yes,
so
please.
much to you and to
Okay.
everyone else. and we will take
Okay.
care. Soon.
Thank
See
you
you on the
folks
trail.
very much indeed. Okay. Thank you, Beth, very much indeed. Okay. Bye.
Bye.